Right, so this is going to be a bit of an introduction to some ring fence work. This isn't true ring fence work because I'm going to be using a bearing guide on the cutter rather than an actual ring fence setup. But it's exactly the same principle, or pretty much exactly the same principle, whether you're using a proper ring fence that you use the guide or template against, or whether you're using a bearing to run the template against. So I've got a basic pattern here. I'm going to make a better version of this. This is just the mock-up that I came up with to design the bracket, and that's roughly the curve we're looking at producing in each piece. So we want that curve to be repeated. I've got 24 of these to make, so this is going to be the quickest way to get a nice smooth cut. Now the only issue I'm facing with these is because I want the grain going through like this to keep the strength in the grain. We might get a bit of tear out on this grain here. So I'm just debating whether I do the brackets, the cuts from both directions rather than just one single direction in one movement. So what I might end up doing is cutting into here on all of them, and then turning the cut around so it's reversed, then cutting back into there. So on both cuts I'm cutting into the grain rather than getting to the centre point here and this grain here creating a rougher cut because it's cutting out away from that grain, so it's unsupported. So we'll see how it goes. We might get away with it, we might have to do it from both sides. So the key with the ring fence work is to have a lead in and a lead out. The lead out's not quite so important, but a lead in is really important for a nice smooth start on the wood so that it doesn't dig in and throw the workpiece back at you. So what I mean by lead in is a separate piece of timber off here that you can push your template and your piece of material up against the bearing or the ring fence, get it all set up and rested and comfortable, and then lead the cut in and start cutting from that point on. If you didn't have this piece and that was your bearing and you wanted to cut this out, that first little cut there, you've got to drop it into the cutter before the bearing will hit this piece, and it just leads to it's snagging or cutting slightly deeper on that point because it's got some force behind it moving up to that stop, so it just does a slightly deeper cut and you get a bad cut. So having something to guide the piece in is really important. So I think what I'm going to do is replicate this piece here with a nice smooth cut, one that's not just roughly cut out, with a longer extension off this edge, and just have a piece mounted on the back of these two faces that I can just quickly hold the timber against before I put it into the spindle moulder. So it's a nice and quick operation to swap the two pieces around. So I've got a fairly decent sized piece of ply. You don't want anything too small because it's going to make it awkward for you to hold on to. So looking at a decent sized piece, you don't want to be trying to hold a tiny little piece like this right next to a massive spindle moulder cutter that's removing a lot of material. You want to be away from it and nice and safe. So with that in mind, we've got to have this built so that we can hold on to that, and then we've got a jig over the top of it like this that the bearing guide can run alongside. What I want to avoid is putting any screw fixings into the face of this that I've then got to fill later on. I want to just keep it nice and clean. So if we make another one of them, square that piece up. Going to leave a gap in the corner here so that I can see when the actual pieces I'm working on are up against both surfaces, so I know that it's in the corner. It's easier without a camera in the way. Try not to get your head in the way. make sure they're beneath the surface. We're running a spindle moulder. We want a hole drilling to support them. We're going to use to hold them in place. So a little screw that just pulls that into place. Very nice. Right, so I've got a way of holding my workpiece in the actual jig. I've got a nice big jig, so once that's fixed in place, I can keep my hands away from the actual cutter and the workpiece, so I can be right back here and away from that cutter. So now I just need to make a template that's going to sit over this that the bearing can run against. So something like this with an extended piece here that I can sit the bearing against and then enter the cut nice and smoothly. So basically another version of this with a longer talon on the end. If I just cut a piece of that out like that. That's just going to be my lead-in piece there. So I want to cut this out and make it really nice and smooth, because this is going to be what all of the pieces are copied to. In order to smooth that inside edge, I'm going to use this little, it's like a bobbin sander, but it doesn't bob up and down like a bobbin sander would. So you have to be a bit more gentle with it, because it tends to sand in exactly the same place all the time, unless you move it. But all it is just a ring of aluminium with a slot cut in it, and you put normal hand sanding paper in it of your desired grit, and you fold it round in a manner such as that, and poke it through the slot. And then it cuts in this direction and self-tightens around itself as it works. And this aluminium tube, if you can see the machining here, tapers off to nothing, just acts as a cam lock. So you put that in place, then you turn it in the direction of the spindle, and it locks that sandpaper on the inside of the tube. Make sure you put it in the right way and the rotation direction is correct, else it will just throw it straight back out at you. And you have to be a little bit careful, because they can let go and throw the sandpaper off at random times if you're a bit hard on it. But it's a great tool if you've got a spindle moulder but not space for a bobbin sander. It's a really good tool for doing that curved work. You also want to turn the speed down. I'll put mine on 3,700. And I can mount this in the jig. I'm going to just have a little bit of a gap between this and this, the actual workpiece, so it's nice and easy to slot the different pieces in and out. I have just realised that I lent my top bearing to someone quite a long time ago actually, that fits the rebater size, and I've not had it back yet, so I've not got it in the workshop. So it looks like we might be using a homemade ring fence to do this. Should be quite good for you to see. Yeah, I'll quickly run through the ring fence or the top bearing cutter with you. I'm not going to use this technique because, like I say, I've not got the one that I'd normally use with me in the workshop. So you'd have a rebater like this, or whatever profile that you were cutting. Then you have a bearing of exactly the same dimensions or diameter of the cutter that sits on top of it. And you clamp this in the spindle with the actual cutter. And then once you fire the machine up, the bearing starts spinning. And then when you introduce your workpiece, so you can see the kicker piece here is why we've got that piece on. You'd sit that against the bearing first, it'd stop the bearing, and then you just rotate the cutter in and it's nice and smooth to cut your profile out like so. Where that differs to a ring fence is, a ring fence, this is just a square piece, but you get the impression. A ring fence sits over the top of the cutter and is fixed to the machine, and then basically you're using that point as the point you're going to be machining against. So it's exactly the same principle, it's just you've got fixed points on the machine. It's like a fixed fence on the machine rather than being attached to the cutter, and then that piece of wood is what you work the material against. The advantage of a ring fence is it can be adjusted for depth, so if I want to cut the rebate, I don't know, 5mm deeper, then I've got my jig here, I can just wind that ring fence back and then cut a little bit deeper. So my ring fence is somewhat of a homemade job. So all I need to do is make a profile piece of timber and then set up to a point, so a high point on that. You can change the shape of this curb and cut it to what you want, or make a new one of these. Depending on the size of the cutter you're using, if you've got a really small cutter, you can make a more pointed profile. But the idea of a ring fence is to set up this cut so it hits a point on this curve here. So if we just choose a line there, and that's the point it's going to cut at. So if I start feeding it on here, it's not going to cut as deep as this point here. And then I just basically get a different thickness rail out, depending on how high I need this to be. I just rip a piece of timber down and screw it to this base plate that bolts to the bed. It's a very simple design, there's no dust extraction or anything, but it's very simple and effective for the amount of time that I actually use a ring fence, which is not very often. Right in the middle, so we've got plenty of adjustment. So if I just bring the camera over the top, you can see that my rough diameter of this piece is a lot bigger than the cutter beneath it. So all that's going to allow me to do is just have an exact point at which the cut depth is. So as long as I make sure when I'm feeding the timber through it hits this tick mark here, which is my deepest part of the cut, then I should be fine to keep it or follow that profile exactly. Okay, so let's make a first cut. Kind of goes without saying that this screw doesn't want to protrude into your cut area. I'm just going to put some wax on the bottom of this board, make sure it glides nice and easily, so you need all the help you can get to keep things smooth. Done a really clean cut on the exit of that grain there, so I'm not too bothered about having to turn the cutter around and come in from this direction, so that's really nice and smooth. It's not going to be a problem whatsoever. Now they've been moulded, I'm going to cut the square ends. I didn't do this for a start in case when I was moulding them curves it tore any timber out on the exit of that cut. So at this point here, I didn't want any furrings or tearing in that point if I'd already pre-cut the ends. So I can now make a nice clean cut on both ends of the bracket. There we go, I've got two sizes of bracket here. You just got to remember to put the right one with the appropriate size front. All I've got to do is drill some holes and then screw and glue them together.